All right, so I'm hoping that we will finish our discussion of evil today, and I'm not hoping we are going to finish it because I want to move on to virtue, and I want to move on to discussions of the what is not allegory, but the Christian elements of the story. I want to talk about the movie adaptation of it and the consequences of it, the effect on the audience. I want to talk about some of the implements that are used, like the mirror and the file of Galadriel and so forth. We'll see what I get through on that front. But and I want to talk about the virtues. So I've talked a lot about evil. I want to talk about the moral virtues that Tolkien describes in the characters, which I think for most evangelicals are going to go straight over our heads because there's very little discussion of that, but it's essential to Tolkien's portrait, and also I think to a lesser degree, but still there, in Lewis's own work, and he talks about it in Mere Christianity. If people say that they love Mere Christianity, but I think if that's true, then you haven't. How carefully have you read it? Because it begins with a discussion of the Tao. He doesn't call it the Tao, but he talks about natural law. And then he describes two types of evil in Book 2, two views of the world. And the one that he disputes is what he calls dualism, but it's actually the Manichaean dualism. And again, talks about the appeal to some notion of good, which we don't get from that good and evil, or one is correct, rather. So if we say that there's a good and evil, we perceive that in the world, and we say that one of them is correct or true, we're now appealing outside the system of good and evil. And where do we get that notion from? He again suggests that we have a natural awareness of that and are judging on the basis of it. And then he will move on later on to the moral virtues and so forth, which are all rooted in the ideas of the great Christian tradition. So both of them are firmly entrenched in a Protestant Catholic consensus on virtue, which we hear very little about in evangelicalism. So that's why I think it's important to look at it, and also because it comes out in the books. But I want to look at a couple of the manifestations of evil that I haven't talked about yet, and one is the delusion that comes from believing that one sees the future. I talked about it last time in with respect to Galadriel's mirror, but we saw it also in the Palantir, the seeing stones, which Denethor uses and sees certain things on the basis of that. And these would be akin in the ancient world to studying astronomy, and on the basis of what one sees, quite clearly saying that there's an absolute certainty that this is going to happen. So for instance, you could say that the constellations of the planets and the stars that pointed out Jesus' birth were a terrific sign of something. But you wouldn't have known what that sign was without biblical revelation telling you exactly what was happening then. But you would certainly note that there was a nova in terms of the astronomy of the world. There's never been a constellation of planets like this, or a star that sat there and has not moved for a long time. What would that mean? It's quite clear to the biblical, those of the Old Testament, at least those who are following it closely, what it means exactly. It's the coming of the Messiah, and yes, it will be in Bethlehem, in fact. But those are only a few wise men. You could also think it's some calamitous event, right? And so you could misunderstand what the nature of the sign was. And that's really what's happening with Galadriel's mirror. you can look into it and you can see things happening in the future. And they may happen. But she says some things have happened, some things are yet to happen, some things have not yet come to pass. And they may not happen at all, which is a funny old thing. Well, why would you look into it then? If it could be any of these possibilities, why would you bother looking? Remember when Frodo looks, he sees the scouring of the Shire. And he's tempted then to want to go back and stop it, because he sees it quite clearly. And it's an understandable response. But the thing that he sees does actually come to pass. But it would, if he sought to prevent it, he would then not do the thing that he had to do, namely to destroy the ring. So the deceptiveness of following things that are even a true vision, they don't have any sort of, I talked about this in relation to Sauron's eye, there's no depth perception. There's no sense of the need for wisdom in interpreting signs, even clear, rationally indisputable signs. There's no wisdom there. There's also a temptation, just like Sauron, to seek to act decisively on what one sees and to control it with the coercive power of reason, and no longer to have faith in providence. And also it tends to give way to despair, because there's a sense of inevitability and yet a hopelessness that ensues. And I talked about that a little bit last time. The desperation that comes in, particularly with Denethor. So he's even willing to throw his still living son on a fire while he's alive. It drives him mad. So the knowledge is not in and of itself a good thing when it is not coupled with faith and hope and love. It is self-destructive, and the knowledge of Galadriel's mirror is potentially self-destructive. So it needs, the wise can manage to look into it, and that's what Galadriel says to Frodo. If you were wise enough, you can look. And she thinks he is, and he proves to be, because he doesn't turn back. But he sees something that then comes about. So in a sense, that too gives a sense that things happen not in a arbitrary fashion, but in an orderly fashion, a providential fashion. Everyone would like to know what's going to happen in their future. Who am I going to marry? What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? Those sorts of things. You really want to know those things, particularly at when you're young. But it never goes away. But it's particularly when you're young, because it's all possibilities at that point, relatively speaking. What would happen if you actually did know? Would you ruin it? Like if you met somebody and said, that's going to be my wife, my husband, how would you treat that person? Would the person then be creeped out? Would run away from you? Would you no longer be involved in courting and attracting the person to you? Or would you just say, okay, well, this is going to happen, so I've seen a few times men saying to girls, God's told me that we're to be married. Like I've always said, if somebody ever says that to you, run away. Which I don't think they actually need my advice on, because that's enough of a warning sign. Well, he hasn't told me. Yeah. And there's a compulsive character to it then, right? In the sense, well, if that's true, then I don't really have a choice in the matter. Exactly. Yeah. So it then becomes a coercive thing. Even if it's not intended, it has that capacity. So you need the wisdom to be able to handle the future, and note that God tells us that we are not to worry about the future, but to think only and care only about what there's sufficient care for today and what it brings. So don't be anxious. So with knowledge, sorrow is increased. He who increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. And so that is a real risk there. So it's a temptation to see things as inevitable or even fatalistically. And that, as we see in the ancient world, gives way to a sense of tragedy and despair and hopelessness. And thereby, they think it's permissible to commit suicide, for instance, which is exactly what Denethor then does. He takes his own life. So that's interesting. Second thing, and this is really, and I said evil is insidious or subtle. Insidious is a good way of describing it. Virtue, there is an appeal of evil to virtue even more than to vice. So, for example, the Pharisees. The Pharisees love God's law. The consequence of that is that they take pride in being God's people and thinking that the merit of their devotion to God's law is why God favors them. It's because they're good and because they love the law of God. But note how they regard their pagan neighbors then. They're sinners. God loves us. God hates our neighbors. We too can disdain our neighbors. We too can treat our neighbors with the same disregard as God apparently does, because he's chosen us. So they think there's something worthy in them. And note that Jesus in particular goes after the Pharisees. He's the harshest critic of the Pharisees, those that are self-righteous in their own eyes. Because they note that they attribute their faith to themselves rather than to God. They don't think that it's a gift of God. They think it's their own achievement through obedience to the law. So much so that they actually deny that they are sinners. The comment of Ralph Wood, and I think this is not, he's not off the mark here, is he says this is an even bigger problem among Christians who think that their holiness of life earns them honor before God. And he notes that in Paul's letter to the Romans and also the Galatians, those that use their salvation in God to condemn others are particularly in danger. Romans 2. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, whoever you are, when you judge another, for in passing judgment upon him, you condemn yourself. Because you, the judge, are doing the very same things he's just talked about in Romans 1, all those who have tried to save themselves through their own means. And the Pharisees are included among those, not just the pagans. Although Romans 1 is talking about the pagans, but he will include everybody. And there's only one exception to that that is held up, and that's Abraham. He'll deal with him in Romans 4, right? The man of faith, right? Not of works. So let's look at this in relation to a few characters and the danger of evil to the virtuous, because it's stronger. The evil is more dangerous to the virtuous than the vicious. For example, Gandalf, the most admirable of all the characters in The Lord of the Rings. Everyone loves Gandalf, I think. I just named my cat after Gandalf. Gandalf the Grey. It's a grey cat, so there we go. Just couldn't come up with a name. I thought it was clever. He is chiefly, now we note his wisdom and his power, But that's not the thing that is Tolkien notes is his most prominent characteristic. His most prominent characteristic is his pity, at least by his own confession. So, for example, when Frodo offers him the ring, right at the outset, when Bilbo drops it and Frodo then offers it to him, he doesn't want to take it, Gandalf says this, "No! With that power I should have power too great and terrible, and over me the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly." His eyes flashed and his face was lit as by a fire within. "Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity. Pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me, I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me." So it's pity. And how do we note the pity? So he takes pity on who? Gollum. Yeah. And he wants Frodo to spare Gollum repeatedly. As it turns out, he's correct in this, but his pity is most evident in the creature that's most despicable. It is a good virtue, but here it would become the greatest vice. Why? Firstly, there are two sides to this coin. Firstly, he would protect the defenseless. You may say, so what? That's a good character trait. But they would never grow up. They would never stand for themselves. He would become Gandalf, the eternal nanny. Nobody would ever become morally capable of standing, as the hobbits do by the end of the Lord of the Rings. He sends them back. You don't need me anymore. Because now you have the strength within yourself. You have grown up. You're mature now. Nobody would ever grow up if Gandalf's pity overruled everyone else. And he kept bad characters from oppressing weak characters. Very interesting. A lot of commentary could be made on the modern social state and the effect of taking pity on the weak without requiring them to grow in virtue. So always showing compassion for children who are badly behaved. Never correcting them, never demanding that they be, understanding that they have needs that need to be considered, accommodated, whatever, but also that if they are going to be a independent and fully functioning individual, they have to learn to stand for themselves. But the nanny state, just like Gandalf, if it uses pity as its primary directive, it would actually harm those that it seeks to help. Is Tolkien commenting on that? Probably not. He's just noting that the virtue of pity, while a real one, is insufficient, and if it's held as its evil is most strongly tied to those who are virtuous. They can do the worst evil. So on the one hand, he would do this. He would protect the weak so well that they would never grow strong. They would remain in eternal childishness or ineptitude. They would never grow strong. Yes?
This reminds me of when Lewis talks about how God is not kind, he's good.
He's good.
Because a kind person is always trying to spare someone else's suffering and
Yes.
just ensure their happiness.
Whereas God uses suffering. This is an extraordinary thing. The problem of evil for Christians is a problem, but it's a problem that actually has we can speak to as having a function for our good. And Tolkien believes that very strongly. Now, if God wanted to spare us from all suffering, he could, but then we would never become the image bearers that he wants us to be. We would never be able to love people fully, because people who are children cannot love others in a self-sacrificially way. That it's always need love, as Lewis calls it. They need love, and they do need love. But they will never be in the position where they'll be able to give it. And that would be the effect of Gandalf's pity. He would use the ring that way. So he actually wouldn't help those who he is helping. Paradox. On the other hand, it would enable him to overlook all evil or forgive it. And so the connection between mercy and justice, pardon and repentance would be broken. He would become like the atheists say Christians ought to be. Why can't God just forgive my sins? Why doesn't he say it doesn't matter? Because he wouldn't be just. That's why. Because you'd have an unjust universe. And you are also complaining about injustice. You can't have it both ways. Do you really hate injustice? Well, then you are going to demand a just God. Do you really want forgiveness of your sins? Yes. Then you want a merciful God. You can't, and you need both of them. But if Gandalf simply forgave all evil, then there would be no justice in the universe. It would be an unjust world. So that's Gandalf's part, and the great evil that would be done there. And think of the great evil that is done by people who seek to usurp God. And I'm thinking chiefly now of the modern social state. They'll take care of health and welfare and education, and yet they don't understand it rightly as being only done when God is exalted and taught, and God's mercy is dispensed, not just looking after people's wounds, but looking after their souls. And the two are not in contradiction. Anyway, so that's the first threat. So the good character of Gandalf and the great evil that would be done if he were to take the ring. Second character that is like him in appealing goodness is Galadriel. A very wise and noble character. Remember, she's part of the Noldor elves, the elves that had been seduced away from Iluvatar and had left the fixed land and wanted to wander off. Feanor being the original elven prince that did this. And she's done much to repair that wounds, and she's very friendly with the company, the Fellowship. She gives them their cloaks of a strange material that allows them to be more or less invisible. They give them the ropes that seem to obey their commands. It gives them, above all that, lembas bread, which has a virtue to it. And the word virtue is intentional here. It actually enhances their virtue, their resistance to evil. It makes them stronger. It doesn't make them physically stronger. It makes their moral character stronger. But we'll get into that later. And she also gives the file of this file, but I'll talk about that later. What is her unique temptation? Well, she is beautiful, apparently. The most beautiful of all. Little Gimli, little courtly love depiction there, falls in love with her, and all he wants is one hair from her head, and that he would treasure it always in his heart. And wow, it's sort of funny in the movie version as well. But this is courtly, and this is courteous, and it is rightly offered. But her beauty and holiness would make her beauty a matter of compulsion rather than adoration, freely offered. People wouldn't love her because they choose to. They would love her because they have to. They would lose their freedom, in other words, just like Sauron wishes to do, not through beauty, but simply through power. But there's a power in beauty, which Tolkien is talking about, and he says that it is he remarks in his letters that it's very difficult for us to conceive of evil and beauty working together. But it's certainly there in ancient literature, and the elves and the beauty of the elves is repeatedly talked about something that is as a perilous threat. But she would then realize her desire to rule independently, which is just the original sin, to be autonomous. And she would be like a god. No one could resist loving her beauty. So I'll quote here. I do not deny that my heart has greatly desired to ask what you offer. For many long years I had pondered what I might do, should the great ring come into my hands. And behold, it was brought within my grasp. The evil that was devised long ago works on in many ways, whether Sauron himself stands or falls. Would not that have been a noble deed to set to the credit of his ring, if I had taken it by force or fear from my guest? And she refuses to take it. She won't take it by force, and she also won't take it when offered, because she recognizes she would be as a queen. And all would love her and despair. It's interesting. Note that love is an ennobling attribute. It does not only revere the person loved, it exalts the person who loves. The humanity and the freedom of the person who loves is retained. Whereas in this case, the freedom of those that loved her would be robbed of them. They would become idolaters and slaves. She would become an idol of beauty, in other words. So she refuses it. So as Gandalf does. But there's the threat, and it's the threat of evil in a very insidious way. It would work with beauty, whereas in Gandalf it would work with pity, both of which we admire greatly, beauty and pity. But we also find that there are characters that are able to resist it. And they're lesser characters in some ways, but nonetheless admirable. One of them is Faramir, who is presented as a sap in the movie. Not very likable at all, I don't think. Not admirable at any rate. If you read the books, you have a different opinion, I think. At least I do. Tolkien presents him much more favorably. In the books, he's got a pet lip, as they say in Britain, because Daddy loves Boromir more than him. He just wants his daddy to love him. And I think, did you read the books? That's not really there. He's not motivated by some sort of, wish for Dad to love him as real as that is. That's not the Faramir of the Lord of the Rings. But Faramir does resist it, and he does it by simply wishing to preserve Gondor in readiness for the king's return. And he says, if the ring came upon me on the road, I wouldn't pick it up. I would not pick up the ring if I chanced upon it on the road. Whereas Boromir wants to use it. I mean, and actually the study in contrast, this is one way of looking at the Lord of the Rings is in terms of foils. There are, and the foils work in multivariant ways. So you've got Gollum on the one here. I'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. We've got Gollum on the one hand, and Smeagol even, actually. That's an interesting foil, the one character to the other. But then also those two characters to Frodo. And then again, you can put Sam in there. And how do these characters all relate to one another? And you can compare Aragorn to Boromir, or Boromir to Faramir, the three men there. And then you can also include some of the riders of Rohan in that mix, because they have similar attributes. And then you can look at different female characters, although they're lesser depicted in the stories, but still you can see something of that there. But Faramir is able to resist the magnetic lure of the ring. Why is that? Because he has a pure heart, I would submit to you. He does not see himself as a leader and a hero. Almost all important. He is not great in his own eyes. He's not proud, in other words. He's humble. He's a servant. Or as Tolkien puts it, he is a steward. And he's very happy to be a steward and not a king. He's not seeking for greater honors for himself than he has. But both Boromir and Saruman regard themselves as leaders and heroes. Now, they are actually, this is an interesting thing, this is not fancy. They are actually in leadership positions, there's no doubt about it. I mean, Saruman is the chief of the order, right? And Gandalf below him, but ironically, those in positions of leadership cannot see themselves as deserving the status of leaders. They need to look upon themselves as servants if they're going to be proper leaders. Otherwise, they fall prey to the seductions of the ring. And we see that Boromir and Saruman both do that. Boromir's a mighty man of Gondor. Right? And Saruman goes from Saruman the White to Saruman of many, the coat of many colors. We'll come to that in another talk as well. But there's a purity of heart, there's an integrity of their souls and their conscience and their actions that does not allow them to see themselves too greatly in their own eyes. They see themselves as servants, in other words, the sort of servant leaders that Jesus talks about. All of those characters, Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Faramir, Galadriel, even those that are the greatest, like Galadriel, is not willing to sees leadership as something that she deserves. She's willing to be diminish and go off into the West. Tolkien is making, in other words, a spiritual commentary on not just the 20th century, he's talking about human nature then, because this is the threat in our day among church leaders still to this day. And obviously secular leaders, but all leaders, those that regard themselves as great leaders, are monsters and end up not being leaders but tyrants, because they and this is a description that goes all the way back to Plato, they will not allow the freedom of others. They tyrannize them. It's certainly a delicate balance for sure, because if you're in leadership you have to make decisions, but do you regard yourself as a leader that can't be contradicted or thwarted? Well, you'll find out. So if somebody opposes you, how do you respond to the opposition? Do you welcome the criticism? Do you crush it? So Faramir will not use the ring. He simply wants to preserve Gondor in readiness for the king's return. He's just a steward. That's his job. He's not going to move beyond that. He's not going to seek to fight off evil. As real a threat as it is, he can't do anything more than that. If he seeks to do more than his vocation, then he will destroy everything good. Galadriel wants only to protect Lorien from the assaults of the evil one. I mean, when I first read it, I was frustrated by her. Why didn't she join the company? Or some of the other elves? We're told they're great. Greater than Legolas. You know, he's a wood elf. He's a lesser elf. Why do they send him? Why doesn't one of those characters go along? Because it would make sense. Going to assault. How come? It's because of their wisdom. How about Bilbo? Well, Bilbo also has now, after he's given up the ring, has devoted himself to the good in a way that is not going to make him more than what he is, which is simply a hobbit. So he devotes his life to scholarship. He writes books, he writes poems, he translates Elvish works into the language of hobbits. This is a good thing. It's a limited good, but it's a real good. You can't change the world. Your generation, just like mine, has always been told you can change the world. What a stupid thing. I hope you don't actually believe that. It's simply not true. But you can do good. That I do believe. I do believe, and your ability to do that will, to some degree, depend on your estimation of yourself in relation to God and what He brings into your power to have authority over your family, your work, whatever. These are goods. Sam would be, of course, for him, he just wants to serve Frodo. That's all. It's his master, and he's going to stick to that. And he doesn't need anything else. He doesn't want anything else. The temptation for the ring was to be Samwise the Great, which means a great gardener, which is kind of funny. But in the end, he gives that up. He doesn't want to be that. He simply wants to be Samwise, the servant of Frodo. He's happy with that vocation. And there's a goodness in it. And he sticks to that, and he doesn't seek to go beyond that. So there's a humility in all of those characters to not try and be more than what they are. So they're not great in their own eyes. And so they don't lord it over other people. So they resist the ring simply because of that. Whereas Boromir is not small in his own eyes. He recognizes what Aragorn says about him. He's a mighty man of Gondor, and he knows it. The valiant man. So much so that he thinks that it's his task to fight off the evil that is coming to threaten Gondor, even though he knows he can't do it, because only the king can do that. He's not the king. He's merely a steward. He's not satisfied with that, nor is Denethor. In fact, they're contemptuous of the very idea of the king. And when they find out that there is a king, they reject him because look at him. He consorts with what sort of people? Just like Jesus did. He's consorting with a rabble in the woods. He doesn't consort with his own people, in fact. He dresses in rags. There's nothing kingly about this fellow. Boromir wants to defend the all-out assault on Gondor, and so he's going to fight down to the end. Okay, that's great. But note how he sees it. It's a desperate battle that he can't win. So he's marked by despair. His strength and his inability to actually fight the thing that he sees arising is going to lead him to a heroic, failed defense of Gondor. It's still heroic, but it will not succeed. He knows it. He won't use the ring, he'll tuck it away, and only in the utmost point of need will he use it. Well, and then it wins one way or the other. So it's a desperate understanding. Again, a great comment by Ralph Wood. Boromir fails to discern the indivisibility of the virtues. You can't truly be courageous without being wise and just and temperate. And in particular, his courage, he understands it not in Christian terms, but rather in pagan, secular terms. So courage is dying on the field of battle. You're willing to kill in defense of the good. Whereas the Christian distillation of the classical pagan virtue of courage becomes martyrdom. Offering your life up as a witness to the good of Christ. To defend your faith, you're willing to give up your own life. That becomes courageous. That's the new understanding of courage. Note that the Battle of Pelennor Fields, when Aragorn goes out with all of the company, they go there to witness to the truth. They're going to remain faithful. They're surrounded by their enemies. They know it's all over. They're not going to win. They're under no illusions that they can win that battle. And they're going to march out anyways. They're going to remain faithful. It's a witness to it. And yet there's also a hope, because there's a hope that Frodo and Sam might yet destroy the ring. But it's not within their grasp anymore. They're not trying to fight the enemy and beat the enemy. They're going to be a sign that we will not use the enemy's means to defeat the enemy, because then we become like the enemy. So that's great stuff. Compare, contrast. Yes?
So would you say then Boromir finally reaches that point of true courage when he gives his life to protect like Frodo and Sam?
Yes, because and then he repents and he asks for their forgiveness. I mean, to some degree he isn't, because he's just fighting there, right? So it's not sufficient that he merely fights for them, because he would have done that anyway. He's not a bad guy. He just wants the ring to do good. And defending them, the old guy would have done that as well. It's when he, in dying, then repents and asks for their forgiveness for the wrong seizing of the ring. That's when he shows the motivation for his actions. There's nothing wrong with the fighting per se. Like, Tolkien is not saying that good people cannot fight, even as martyrs. But they cannot let their understanding of victory be simply a military conquest. That cannot be. Whereas Boromir is willing to die, but he's going to die as a hero. And he is filled with that desire, as is who else? The great female character in The Lord of the Rings. What's her name?
Eowyn?
Yes, Eowyn. She's also desperate. She's tired of being closeted away, looking after the kids, waiting, as a steward, looking after them, just waiting for the inevitable destruction of all things. She wants to go out and fight, just like those whom she loves and admires. But there's a despair in her, just like Boromir. There's an inevitability. She thinks that the destruction is inevitable, and she wants to die with her boots on, rather than in a cave waiting for an ignominious end that nobody will see, protecting the defenseless. And then she does a great valorous task, but she is greatly harmed, and in the end, we'll look at her character later. She needs to be restored in her vision, and she is so by Faramir, actually. And so that's an interesting, that dynamic, we'll have to look at that, because that's really interesting. So Boromir would go down, and so would Eowyn. And in the end, Boromir cannot distinguish his means to victory from the means that Saruman would use, which is, I'm going to win, and I'm going to defeat my enemy, and the means, if I need to, I can use the ring. Well, it's a coercive might. Well, what are you actually defending then? You've abandoned just war theory. You're willing to use any means. There's nothing you will not do. In which case, how do you become any different than your enemy? That way. So Tolkien is investigating the nature of war in modern warfare, in which, remember, we go back to what we said about Tolkien or Lewis. The great war that was fought on both sides was following the great myth of progress. Both sides thought that they were advancing the progress of humanity. Both sides, and favored by God as such, and were willing to use all means to destroy their enemies. First it was mustard gas, then ultimately the atom bomb was dropped. Okay? Was that a good action or not? It's a really debatable one, that. And you will hear a lot of debate on that particular one. Some say that it was the right thing to do because it ended the war, which it did. Was it an evil act because it was dropped on cities, civilians? Because the total war of the First and Second World Wars was no longer armies fighting armies; it was armies attacking civilian populations without discrimination. Total war. Dropping an atom bomb in another country, that's total war. Just using a greater technology, so we'll talk about the technology as well in a minute. Did you have a comment or question? You wanted to read something?
Well, I love the way you're contrasting Boromir and Faramir.
Well, that's a clear foil being set up there,
yeah,
right?
I love it. I found it fascinating that Frodo felt up in the chair of knowledge the evil eyes boring on him, yet when he turned, Boromir's face was still kindly.
Yeah.
Yet he felt.
So there is another foil.
Yeah.
Got two eyes on him.
But by contrast,
one's trying to compel him, the other is got him in his grasp and in his power, and he lets him go. So again, compare and contrast.
But his brother's nobility, you're absolutely right,
Sure.
Dr. Masson. I didn't care for the way Faramir was portrayed in the film.
Yeah, it's just sappy, and he becomes a weak and shallow character.
But he's nothing like that.
No, not in
here.
the books, no.
This is amazing.
Yeah,
It
he's one of the
says
most
here
noble characters.
to Sam. But I am not such a man, or am I wise enough to know that there are some perils from which a man must flee?
Yeah.
Sit at peace and be comforted, Samwise. If you seem to have stumbled, think that it was fated to be so. Your heart is shrewd as well as faithful, and saw clearer than your eyes. For strange though it may seem, it was safe to declare this to me.
Yes.
It may even help the master that you love. It shall turn to his good, if it is in my power. So be comforted.
Yeah.
What a difference.
Yeah, it's a straight. Yeah, not quoted in the book or in the movie, obviously, and a character motivation which is essential to understanding what happens there. Because I'm going to let you go. Why? Why would you let him go? Like it's inexplicable. Other than I guess he's a son who's been not well loved by his dad, and he just wants his dad's love. But now he's going to provoke his father because he's an angry rebel son or something like that. I mean, the motivation's totally unclear. It makes no sense. You need that little bit of dialogue to explain why he makes the decision. As I say, it destroys the book or the integrity of the story when you remove the motivations that Tolkien gives to the characters. That's not the only instance. I mean, to some degree, I have sympathy for the filmmaker, because it's really, these are rich, complex characters and hard to present so many. Well, but Faramir is not a minor character. He's a significant character, particularly in contrast to Boromir. But they're not even interested in Boromir. They're just, it's Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn that's going to get the attention. Okay. And then they spend so much time in the battle scenes, like half an hour, which is dealt with in a chapter in the book, not even that. Just passes over. Anyway. So that's one aspect of the insidiousness of evil. It's particularly dangerous to the good. They are the most threatened by evil. And not because they're evil, but because they're good and it appeals to their goods. The thing that is most characteristic of them is the thing that they would most follow. And that would be the worst thing they could do, because there's no unity with all the other things that need to be balanced. Justice, and mercy, for instance. And above all, this purity of heart, willing to be a servant and be limited in your understanding of what you can do as a small little being. There are other threats, and I want to talk about here now about the critique of transhumanism, which I think is implicit at the very least, maybe even explicit in Tolkien. We talked about this in Lewis repeatedly, in conjunction with Weston, for instance. So at first he wishes to colonize Malacandra. Or he's going to go there, and he doesn't care who he has to kill to get in the way, because he's a humanitarian, and he wants to bring human life all over the world, or all over the cosmos, rather, and thereby aid the longevity of the human race, or promote it as sort of a Darwinistic evolution of the human species, so they go everywhere, to all planets. And then he repents of that in the second book, and he realizes that he was wrong to do this, and he was acting in a carnal way, and really he didn't understand the importance of spirituality. And so then we move onto a different realm. What do we mean by the extension of human nature? Weston thinks of it as as a spiritual good rather than a material good. Begins as a materialist, then moves on to the spiritual realm. Compare and contrast Weston with Gollum. Gollum comes upon the ring. How does he come upon it? Well, he steals it and murders, actually. And then he retains it as a possession, and he is consumed by it. In isolation, in the darkness, he loses the fellowship of all others of his like. He hates the light, he hates the darkness, he hates himself. He pities himself, he loathes himself. What does he get in recompense for this? Longevity of years. He lives on a long time. What is he able to do? He's able to satisfy his most basic instincts. He likes raw fish. He won't eat cooked things. He can't eat cooked things, in fact. Cooking is an aspect of civilization. He's going back to primal origins, and he lusts after raw flesh. And he lives a very long time. So the effect of this is he becomes a hollowed out character. How does evil work upon him? It hollows him out. Physically he does. He looks like a distortion of himself. Pale, emaciated, etc. But more than that, his spiritual nature is emaciated. So the Tao in him is hollowed out. The moral goodness. And I think, again, this is Wood's comment, I just think he's right. And so if he's right, what's the point in saying anything different? This is a commentary on the modern, and that's by modern I mean the transhumanist obsession with the quantity of goods and the extension of life, and with total disregard for what they would call the quality of life. And by quality, we're talking then about good and evil, and beauty as opposed to ugliness, and truth as opposed to falsehood. For the modern humanitarian, transhumanist state, they want everybody's bodily needs to be looked after to the utmost and to live as long as they possibly can. So these are bodily extensions of bodily life, so we want to live to who knows how long. And I've put up some links on the course webpage, but you can just search for themselves. Silicon Valley and their attempts to prolong human life. It goes from injecting the blood of youthful individuals into their veins, so that because there's some, I don't know yet, the blood of young people is more potent, more healthy than their own blood, so that sort of transfusion of blood, to other means of extending human life at the cost of all moral considerations. We saw that in the Frankenstein novel. So we want to enhance human life in terms of power and on longevity at the expense of all moral considerations. what's the purpose of life? Is it what it was once to worship God? The Westminster Short Catechism. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's the chief end. If that's the chief end, then all other ends are subordinate to it. To glorify God and enjoy him forever. And if you're going to do it forever, then you start it now. Because that's the way it's going to be eternally. That's the chief end. What is it now? It is to be bodily gratified in every possible conceivable way to the utmost, and to be entertained, to be given therapy to allow that to happen for as long as possible. And the only evil then is death. You live in order to live. Life is good because it's life. I want to live so that I can live. Why do I want to live? So that I can live. This is terrible. Most people want to live because they don't want to die. That's not a very good reason, actually. So he notes, and I think this is a great illustration as well, the medieval cities are focused on cathedrals. If you look at any old medieval city in Europe, you'll see that the cathedral, if they are cathedral cities, it dominates the landscape. So in Durham, where I was for 9 years, the cathedral was visible from miles around. It was set on a little hill. That's where they sought in general to put cathedrals, so that you could see it from a distance and go to the cathedral. And that was the center of civic life, because they understood that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So this is going to mark civic life. It's right front and center. And you can't build a building taller than the cathedral, because that is the of utmost. So it's symbolic. What are the centers of our cities? Tourist attractions, medical complexes like hospitals, malls, golf courses, entertainment complexes, gambling, whatever, right front and center. We're going to put it right on the waterfront. Entertainment and health and welfare. Our health and welfare. But no transcendent good is even not only not acknowledged, it is despised. So there is an absolute mania for living long and indulging in all kinds of pleasures without asking why do we receive pleasure, and what is the good in pleasure, and what actually is joy. These things are characteristic of our day. So the lure of the ring is that it gives you a long life. That is actually one of the attractions of it. The other is power, of course, we've already talked about. Power. And the third is invisibility. Let me talk about invisibility, because this is an interesting thing. When you put on the ring, you disappear from sight, right? At least from everyone but Sauron and the ring wraiths. And that strange Tom Bombadil. Come to that guy. And it also can't block the vision of those who are pure, those in the undying lands. That's actually very interesting. And here, I think a number of commentators have rightly noted that the ring of power is like Plato's ring of Gyges, talked about in the Republic. And the ring of Gyges is obviously well known to Tolkien. And I'm not sure if it's read. Has anyone read the Republic here now? The whole of the Republic?
Oh,
No.
Extra.
Yeah, extracts. It should be read in its entirety, really, just like the City of God. But, I mean, by reading some of it, you've done better than 99% of all university students. So I'm not going to review. But it's mentioned in Book 2 of the Republic. Ring of Gaiji allows the owner of the ring to become invisible at will. And it's presented by Glaucon. So it begins with this dialogue between Plato and Thrasymachus, and then it moves on to Glaucon. And Glaucon recounts a myth of how a man found a golden ring, which he puts in his pocket, and when he puts it on and adjusts it, he can turn invisible. And with that, he can do numerous things. Well, what does Gyges do? He seduces the queen. He helps murder the king, and he eventually becomes the king himself. That's what he does with this ring. And he does this to illustrate what people will do with power when there's no this discussion of justice. And remember, the discussion of justice that Thrasymachus advanced is the right of the powerful to get what they want. That's what justice is. Glaucon comes in and says, yes, and the only reason they don't do that isn't because they love the good, which is what you say, Socrates. It's because they fear consequences. But if they didn't have any consequences, if they could put on an invisible ring like Gyges and get away with it, that's what they would do. That's what he says. He's correct, by the way. If people could get away with it, if you don't think that's true, then never mind. I don't want to take time with that. But if people think that there are no consequences for their actions, they can get away with it, then they do it. People are bad.
Most don't commit crimes to get caught.
They fear getting caught.
They
That's
fear
right.
it, but they don't think they're going to. So
Correct. Yeah. In Schindler's List, the whole plot turns. It's all shot black and white. Have you seen Schindler's List? It's all black and... Okay, well, it's a horrible movie and a great movie. It's shot in black and white. Oskar Schindler is a factory owner, makes stuff for the Nazis. He's not a Nazi, but he makes things, and he's profiting off the war, and he's profiting off the labor of the Jews. And he sees them getting the Nazis are portrayed pretty viciously, drunken, do awful things, and they shoot down a bunch of kids. It's dreadful. And he is looking on, and he's just been profiting, and he thinks, well, this is just business, and I do business with whatever, but he's so horrified by this that he's changed at that point. And he looks over and he sees a little girl crying, and she's wearing a red dress. She's about 3. She's crying because who knows, maybe her mom was shot or whatever, but for the first time, he sees an individual. Before, everything was black and white and gray, and he didn't have to see any color. There was nothing that really moved him, but then he saw this child, and then he realized that he had to do something to stop the killing in his small way, and then he started saving individuals at that point. And why did that, what did it occur? So it happened in plain sight of everybody. And you have to think, why would the Nazis do such a thing in plain sight? And the answer is that they never thought they were going to be held to account for it. Nobody who was there, who saw it, was going to hold them to account. And that includes him. So he was complicit in it. And he realized it. This is an atrocity. I can't do this anymore. But they thought they were never going to be held to account by anyone. In Nazi Germany, they would not be, certainly. But they thought they never would. There was no God that would hold them to account either. This is what people will do, and criminals act that way because they think they're not going to get caught. Actually, we all do that with sin. It's one of the really weird things about sin. It leads to more sin, and it blinds the person doing the sin from self-awareness even. And actually deludes them into thinking that other people can't see their sin. Because we're totally aware when somebody else is sinning. We just don't see it when we are. We are. Right? You can see that that person's got a problem with lust, anger, whatever. It's really evident. But we don't really see it of ourselves. So there's a little bit about the log in your own eye and the mote in your neighbor's eye. You can see that actually it is there, but compared to the log in your own eye, No comparison. Well, the ring of Gyges is like this ring in that it lends invisibility. And with invisibility, note that the correspondence here, it not only lends invisibility, it allows those who use it to think that moral considerations are also invisible. In other words, they're no longer subject to the Tao. They think the Tao is no longer operative. In the same way that you could say, I mean, what does the ring represent is one of the questions of the Lord of the Rings. You're thinking, what does it represent? To some degree, it represents technology. The power of technology to think that we can extend every human good through technological means without losing anything. And what Lewis and Tolkien both depict is that what is lost is a sense of moral goodness. Lewis calls it the abolition of man. Tolkien depicts it as the abolition of man. Right? Yes? No?
I love what Adam said and how you followed up on it, and it struck me when you said that what's the center of modern urban society? Tourist attractions, and Dr. Massey
Sure.
followed up by saying
Sure.
medical complexes, etc.
Also.
Anything but the transcendent, and
Yeah.
that the transcendent isn't just marginalized, it's actually despised.
Spies and the buildings tower over them.
So I'm thinking of when I was over in Chartres. And when I approached Chartres on a train.
What's Chartres?
Chartres Cathedral, I'm sorry. in
Oh,
France.
I see. Okay.
One of the true spectacular.
Yeah.
The outside is all sculptures of the Holy Scriptures, and the inside there are all these panels of stained glass built in the Middle Ages. It took 3 generations to build Chartres Cathedral. So as I'm approaching it on the train, I noticed you can see the cathedral like a gigantic, huge spire, no matter from which direction you approach the town.
Yeah.
And I was told that was deliberate,
Yeah.
because back then it was the center and the heartbeat of the community. So I get there, right? And what are they doing? Conducting tours through it.
Yeah. Same all over Europe.
So
Because they can't afford to keep them up.
So here's what's happened. The transcendence that you spoke of was lost, and Chartres has become what Adam said, a tourist attraction.
Yeah. And you were one of the tourists.
Yeah.
So I lamented that as well while being a tourist. So it's like,
But they don't view it anymore as the
No, it's
center of
only
the
that.
community.
That's the whole value of it. So we're going to keep this because it it's. Why would one come to Europe? Well, because it's got a lot of old buildings. So let's keep the old buildings, but not just because they're old buildings. They're no longer the centers of communal life. They are simply beautiful old buildings. So they've totally lost the nature of what the thing is.
And meanwhile, the sculptures outside and the stained glasses inside are all portrayals of the Gospels.
Yeah.
Because the people couldn't read.
So even though they are misusing it, there's still a good there that goes on in their services, worship, etc. So there are little outposts of goodness in the modern world, really. Yeah. So thanks for that. Let's talk about the coercive power of the ring as well as the final attribute I think we want to talk about. And that is, we've already talked about this to some degree. It seduces everybody in accordance with their virtues. The thing that they most prize in themselves or most characteristic of them, that is the thing that it appeals to. So it's true of what Plato also says, that nobody chooses evil for the sake of evil, they choose it for some perceived good. And further in this case, the perceived good is the thing that we're strongest in. And that's the thing that's going to bring us down. Ironically, because we see there's no possibility of being assaulted there where we're strong. And there's the problem. We're great in our own eyes. In this area, Gandalf, it's pity, as I say. In others, it's beauty. In others, right? So that it varies in accordance with the differences of the characters. But it's also not only seductive, it's coercive. And it enslaves the will. And not even Gandalf can break that power. Only if Frodo will willingly surrender and destroy the ring in Mount Doom will the power be broken. and the power over his own mind even be broken. He has to do it willingly. Because once it's fallen into his grasp, it now has a hold on him such that unless the ring is destroyed, if it were taken from Frodo, it will destroy him. So Gandalf says, I could take it from you. I could take it to you, but if I did, it would break your mind. This is right at the beginning. When he first gets it, he says, already you, too, Frodo, cannot easily let it go, nor will to damage it. And I could not make you except by force, which would break your mind. So it needs to be destroyed in order for him to be freed of it. It's not enough that simply it be destroyed. He has to do so voluntarily. Otherwise, Frodo will be ruined. So note, I said at the end, Frodo is overcome by it and doesn't destroy it. So how do we deal with the contradiction between those two things that were just said? You have to do it willingly. And he doesn't do it willingly. He says, the ring is mine. I think it's because there's a providential destruction of evil there. Which frees him from it. So it's almost, there's the grace of God. Now, when the coercive power of evil is portrayed, Tolkien is tapping into a long tradition stemming from Plato through Augustine, which talks about real freedom being the capacity to choose the good in accordance with our true nature. That's what freedom is. It's the capacity to choose the good, namely God, in accordance with our true nature. Freedom, real freedom, is the liberty to choose and love God. That's what real freedom is. Evil is the opposite. So you can't coerce love of God, for instance. You can't coerce people into being Christians. They can say, you got to call yourself a Christian. That doesn't make you a Christian. There's no compulsion in the Christian faith. There is coercion in other faiths. And they're all external. Here you need to do it in accordance with your heart. How do I know the person is a Christian? He calls himself a Christian. I have no access to that person's heart. He says that he's a Christian. He acts in accordance with it. He also contradicts what he professes. We call that sin. Does that make that person not a Christian? No, it makes him a sinner. But he says he's a Christian, and he acknowledges that Christ died for his sins, so he's a forgiven sinner. That's what he is. And he still sins. Okay, but that doesn't make him not a Christian. It's his profession of faith in the God who died for his sins that makes him a Christian. And that's a free confession. If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart, you will be saved, says Paul. Right? That's it right there. You profess with your mouth and believe in your heart. Okay, and people can do this falsely. They can profess that they're Christians and not believe it in their hearts. We don't know what's in their hearts. But we can only judge on the basis of what they say and then how they act when they're called upon their sins then. So if they're corrected and disciplined for their sins, do they accept the correction? Sometimes it takes time. But the opposite of that is coercion. But what makes them free is that they receive the gift of grace that allows them to receive and freely choose. So it's God's initiative. And we can see that depicted in the Lord of the Rings as well. That there is a sort of a divine initiative, even though there's no mention of God. That there is a understanding that, and it's exhibited in lowliness in their own eyes. They understand that they are not great, even though they are great, like Galadriel and Aragorn and Gandalf. These are great figures, but they don't regard themselves as such. I'm a steward, says Gandalf. Don't you know that I too am a steward? And he doesn't move away from that. There's a humility there. Why the humility? Because he understands that he is not ruling his own ends. There is a greater power at work in the world than he. For those who've read the Silmarillion, they know it's Iluvatar. I will talk about those in coming classes. But we are the outcome of the grace of God and the gifts that come from the grace of God, rather than the decisions that we make even for God. So grace precedes freedom. Because you say, I am the person I am because I chose to do this, to take the road less traveled, as Frost puts it in his poem. That's what made me the man I am today. Well, there are a lot of those. I can point to those moments in my life. But if I did so, I could become very proud and think, well, I made, this temptation to go down this path, and I resisted that temptation. Well, good for me. That makes me a good person, because that was really tempting, and I didn't do it. That would make me into a monster if I thought all those choices, the sum total of all those good choices, were what made me the man I am today, as opposed to it's the grace of God that made me who I am. And because of the grace of God, those decisions that were made along the way were possible. See, now that's depicted here as well. Whereas the One Ring, the effect of the One Ring is it allows no freedom of choice, and the freedoms that are chosen, aside from those that are freed through a sort of a gracious seeing of ourselves as lowly, invariably result in all the things that we described characteristic of evil: autonomy, pride, coercion, lust for power, and when I say coercion, the refusal to allow anyone else free will. They must bow the knee to me. So that depiction of there is consistent. And if we want to compare and contrast Tolkien to Lewis, Tolkien is simply more talking about it in ubiquitous terms, and Lewis is presenting it more in modern day technological era terms. But I think they're both describing a similar sense of selflessness. Remember, the hero of Lewis's sci-fi trilogy is Ransom. He has to realize that he needs to be an obedient servant, and that's how he will be useful to Mal Eldil. Same lesson, right? And it's a Christian lesson. Anyway, final comments, questions? If not, we're going to leave off the discussion of evil, and we will move on to discuss the virtues and the good, because they have significant features that deserve our attention.